Morning, everybody. Crappy Mondays to you, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by comedian and friend of the show, Mark Steele. Morning, Mark.
Hello.
Hope you're well.
Chirpy, aren't we?
Yeah. For a Monday morning, it's all a little bit chirpy, but we'll see how I'm sure we can get depressed and angry before too much has gone. Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to wait until Mark comes to visit your town with his Radio 4 hat on and heckle him then instead. So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a warning from the unions that broken Britain does not need any tax cuts ahead of Wednesday's budget. More on that in a bit later. But first, I want to take us to page 13. Very important. You wouldn't have page 14 without it. But it's about an ongoing cover-up into the Battle of Orgreave. Now, Mark, can you take us through this a little bit? Was this, as it sounds, a pivotal clash between Roundheads and Cavaliers in the English Civil War, or was it something a bit more recent? Seeing as we've got a photo of it, it's on the page.
It was sort of more recent. It was, so in 1984, the miners were on strike. So the origins of this strike is that on the face of it, the Conservative government that had been re-elected about a year earlier under Margaret Thatcher said that it had a plan to shut down the mines or to shut down a number of pits in the Britain's coalfields because the pits just weren't economical. Now, sort of everybody knew that really this was a plan to attack the trade union movement, which was still pretty strong at the time and had brought down the Conservative government between 1970 and 74. And Margaret Thatcher.
So the winter of discontent and everyone was on strike and all the rest of it.
Yeah, well, that was before the winter of discontent. So this was when the trade unions were really powerful, and the Industrial Relations Act had been brought in by the Conservatives, and it had been completely destroyed because so many people went on strike. It wasn't just miners, but the miners were the strongest part of the trade union movement, and if their union could be broken, then the trade union movement would be severely weakened, and that really was the reason for it. And subsequently, all the things that the union said actually underestimated how much they were going to shut down the pits. The Tories were saying this is the way to keep the mines of Britain going, but in fact, they were lying, because they had plans to shut the pits altogether. So the miners went on strike when it became clear that the mines were going to be shut. And there was a critical battle in a place called Orgreave because there was a coking depot where there was big tons and tons and tons of coal that had been stockpiled. And if the coal board could get this out to people, then it would obviously really dampen the effect of the strike. So Arthur Scargill, who was leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, called for a mass picket. And the point of this picket was to try and prevent these lorries from getting out by talking to the lorry drivers and trying to persuade them their union was much, much weaker than it had been and so on, but also to physically stop the lorries getting out. There weren't enough people. The unions had been weakened since the 70s. There weren't as many as there was in these pickets in the 70s. And it was clear this was going to be a major battle in the strike, and the South Yorkshire police, clearly under instruction from the government, operated with a degree of savagery that shocked people and continues to shock people.
No, it wasn't just South Yorkshire, was it? Because there were other forces that got shipped in, the Metropolitan Police from London. They went all the way to Rotherham, where Orgreave is, and they were shipping them in from all over the country, basically for a massive confrontation. One of the pictures that we just saw there was of the number of police officers with riot shields, which I'm just going to explain very briefly for people on the podcast. There's serried ranks here of just coppers, with the bobbies and the helmets on, lined up arm in arm in front of our miners. There's also another shot of like a bigger perspective with some fields and stuff and plants behind. There were mounted cavalry on horses, riot police on horses. Remember, that's about a ton of horse flesh. And they rode those horses, didn't they, into the miners. And here's the picture I was talking about now. You've got a picture here of police officers with riot shields running basically in ranks. They're like 20 deep, running up an area of field, looks like, towards the miners. They stormed, they stampeded those lines. They didn't just stand there and hold them back. they charged them, didn't they?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Now this had been going on already for a few months, but this was by far the biggest sort of pitched battle. I mean, it was a war. But the police had been stopping miners. They'd been stopping them at the Blackwall Tunnel, for example. They knew the registration cars of miners, and they'd stop. Turn them back, and there was an extraordinary degree. There were little pit villages where leaders of where the most sort of prominent people in the local strikes, where their houses had been just invaded and stuff by the police. They weren't clearly not just operating as a sort of independent force. This was the government had told them this. We are at war here. The miners were called the enemy within by Margaret Thatcher. And Orgreave was a key battle, a key component of that.
Yeah, there has to be a degree of organisation, doesn't there? Because if there are miners in Kent, in the pit villages in North Kent, who wanted to get up to Rotherham to join, because you have flying pickets that would move up there and do the picketing, because they had to, because there wasn't enough other people in the union movement, and they're getting stopped at Blackwall Tunnel in East London by the Met. So there is a degree of involvement and organisation trying to block all this. So in June 91, the South Yorkshire Police actually paid just under £500,000 in compensation to a group of about 39 miners for things that included assault, wrongful arrest, unlawful detention, malicious prosecution. A lot of police officers, although there were a number of miners that got charged with riot, there were a number of police officers who were thought to have committed perjury, possibly, by giving false evidence. And later it transpired that some of the officers from South Yorkshire Police that were involved at Orgreave were also involved at Hillsborough. And their names sort of got mentioned at the Hillsborough inquest and so on. So what this story is about in the paper today is there's a whole bunch of files about this, the South Yorkshire Police archives, and they're sitting on it and they're not publishing them, and they're closed until 2066. That there must be, Mark, an awful lot of clues as to who or what was responsible, or any organisation, if there was some, in those files. Why would they sit on it until 2066?
Well, they would sit on it because they contain information that would lead us to conclude that there was a war which was illegal in many ways, apart from being utterly foul and immoral and horrible, against working people at that time. It was really, if you were sort of lucky enough to be young enough not to remember this, it was it was a really brutal time. And it's not, I think many people that have been involved in the Hillsborough campaign and who have tried to uncover the truth about what happened there and the role of the police and certain elements of the press and that have said that it's that the links between this and the miners' strike, it was only a few years afterwards, they are so obvious, really. And it's a bit like an occupying army that suddenly starts to see everybody as a threat. And that was the mood, that was the atmosphere in Britain of the time, I think, is that if you were in the police, you had been trained and conditioned to see everybody, every working person as a threat, if they were a football fan, if they were a miner. And it was the same police force that had been in the centre of both of those horrible episodes.
And it was about militancy, wasn't it, really? And that, you're causing us problems and all the rest of it. But what I don't understand is, this was the South Yorkshire Police of 1980, whatever it was, is not the South Yorkshire Police of 2024, right? It's different officers, mostly. Right? It's 40 years. They all retired on a fat pension now, if they're still with us. The miners in question are in their 70s now, most of them. If this gets held out to 2066, they'll probably all be dead or near enough. And South Yorkshire Police, their job is to pursue justice, isn't it? And to arrest people who've done wrong and committed crimes. And if I went to court and committed perjury, South Yorkshire Police or the ever nearest copper would happily arrest me for something. Why can't the South Yorkshire Police of today have the same attitude towards the South Yorkshire Police then? Is it a government thing? Because we've had Labour governments in since then who should have ordered the public inquiry, who should have ordered the arrest, who should have said, it's in our interest to make Thatcherism look bad. Let's clear it out. Why is this still going on? We haven't had an inquiry. We haven't had prosecutions against people who've done something right, and we haven't had a government that seems to have said, well, let's have the truth.
No, well, there's a couple of things, isn't there? I mean, one is that the police do not necessarily do what the government tells them. If the police decide that they're going to ignore the government, then they will do. And the other thing is that the last Labour government didn't want to associate itself in any way with looking like it was at all supporting the miners, even if it was supporting the miners in as much as they were the ones in this incident that were clearly on the right side of the law. Because the last Labour government, its whole raison d'etre was to sort of was to distance itself from that world, the world of trade unions, particularly at the NUM.
Yeah. It wanted to pretend it had nothing to do with the unions whatsoever, and
yeah, exactly. And I mean, and the next Labour government will be even more like that, I guess.
Yeah. And
also, they're not, as you found with your campaign with the MOD, and that, the fact that the current personnel are entirely different people from the ones from 50 years ago when all this started. There's a mentality a cult mentality. We've got to defend the traditions of the body that we're in, and the police are very, very good at doing that.
It's institutionalism, isn't it? They won't throw it over. And all the Tory governments we've had since then, they don't want to kick Thatcher because she's the best thing that's ever happened to them. And Labour wanted to, Blair and Brown years, they wanted to not move away from it and try not to. That would matter too much. We don't need to kick up that particular dustbin. And so here we are. But there does need to be an inquiry, and it does look increasingly like the next Labour government, if we get one, is going to have an awful lot of public inquiries and compensation to have to find. So, speaking of which, let's go on to the main story of the day. Now, we've been retweeted by Unison because they care so much about this story. And it's the main story of the day, if not the week, which is Wednesday's budget. All right. Now, we're now in this tedious business of expectation management by the Treasury, which always happens before the budget. It means that they're lying to journalists every day that they'll be spending this or cutting that or investing in the other. But, there's no money. Don't get too excited about things. And then, they'll be trying desperately to produce a rabbit from the hat on Wednesday. But frankly, until Jeremy Hunt gets up on his hind legs, we're not really going to know what he's going to say. But the unions today, in today's front page, Mark, they seem pretty certain that he's going to announce tax cuts.
All right.
Why aren't they happy about tax cuts? Surely everyone would be happy about a tax cut.
Well, because the tax cuts don't affect everybody equally. So if the tax cuts are for the people who are already doing all right, then that's not going to make people happy if they're not going to be affected by it. But in some ways, I think the problem they've got is that nobody's listening. Like, the media will talk about the budget and all the excitement and what's Jeremy Hunt. There's a thing on the radio this morning. What's Jeremy Hunt going to do? Well, he could do this. He could do this. We've got the economics, someone from the Financial Times. Well, it could possibly with the borrowing requirements and so on. And I think most people have just stopped listening to them now. And they remind me very much when I was a young comic at the Comedy Store. Sometimes and it was a bit tricky sometimes, the Comedy Store. It could be a bit wild and lively and drunken and a bit
never
marauding. Oh, yeah. And you had to concentrate really to do all right. And sometimes you get a new comic on, and sometimes the older comics we'd stand at the back and watch the new one, and they'd get in a mess. And
you'd heckle them, wouldn't you?
No, you didn't know. This is the thing. You didn't need to heckle them because people weren't listening. The chatting would start, and the audience would all be talking amongst themselves. And the comic, you could see their eyes going, and they're panicking, and their mouths getting dry, and then they just rush. They rush, and we'd be at the back going, "What do you reckon? I reckon he's got about 20 seconds," and then. And it wouldn't matter. The comic could come out with the best joke in the history of language, and it wouldn't make any difference because no one was listening. And then one person in the audience would just go, "Shut up, mate, you still here?" Everyone would laugh, and then they'd have to go. And I think that's where this government is at. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter. They could come out with the best policy that has ever been dreamt of, that Aristotle would not have had the brains to have conjure up, and it wouldn't make any. People would just go, "I thought you'd gone, mate. Shut up."
Yeah.
And I think they're stuffed, and I think that's the problem with his budget. So he might as well do anything. We're going to tax giraffes. That's how we're going to get the economy going. All giraffes. If you've got a giraffe, you've got to pay £1 million. London Zoo are completely furious. No one's going to take any notice.
No, exactly. I tend to think that what you can tell how it's going to go by who the journalists are talking to, and who they're focusing on. And generally, whenever there's an announcement by anything in the government, they just go straight to the next government, Labour, and go, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Because, the big issue is not really what Jeremy Hunt says. It's, well, how is Rachel Reeves going to find her way out of this when they come into power? And if, under Jeremy Corbyn, no one cared what John McDonnell had to say, because, he would stand up and say something mildly amusing and mad, and everyone would write it down. But then no one actually went to them and said, well, now Labour have got a real problem, because how are they going to find their way out of it?
That's a good point.
It didn't happen. The journalists were just like, it's like watching the bookies. Once the bookies start taking bets or stop taking bets on something, how it's all going to go.
Yeah. No, I think it is a bit like that. So he might as well have a laugh with it, mightn't he? He might as well just come up with just really... We're going to tax is going to be done in alphabetical order. So the next month, everyone whose surname begins with A or B, you're paying all the tax.
Hey, what? And the poor Zoroaster whatever's down the road haven't got to pay it for 26 years. No, I think so.
Well, we've tried everything else and it hasn't worked, so we could give it a go, Susie.
Now, the unions seem pretty certain that he's going to announce these tax cuts, but the tax cuts that are being floated so far aren't going to go to the ordinary Joe. So one of the things that it's pointing out in the paper today is that if, for example, you had a 1p cut in national insurance, which would make the difference of bugger all to everybody on your national insurance bill, 1p, half of that, it would raise about £4 billion, all right? And half of that, £2 billion, would go to the richest households, the richest people in the country, like the top few percent. Now, the other £2 billion doesn't go to the poorest households. The poorest households, the actual bottom couple of percent, would only get 160 million. Now, that is less than 10% of the total. The rest gets spread out somewhere in the middle. So, it's 10%, less than 10% to the poorest, and more than half to the richest, and the middle class can kind of grab what's left. Do you think they might, even if Hunt did that the other way around, even if he sort of, brought in a non-dom tax break and tax private schools and tax giraffes and Lotus elites and wives who have billion-dollar stakes in foreign data firms and stuff like that, if he banned everything and somehow managed to redistribute the tax so only the poor people got it and the rich people just got, just had to put up with all the many millions they've got already, do you think the unions would somehow decide they love the Tories? Or would the unions still find a way to moan?
Well, no, of course the unions wouldn't love the Tories, but it's so unlikely they would do that, isn't it? Of course it is. Yeah, it'd be like when Liverpool play Manchester City, if Liverpool deliberately scored 6 goals in their own net, would that make the City fans like them, I think it will need all those things you said and much more, won't it? Because so many things are crumbling. They've been under attack. The austerity years did such damage, and it needs a massive overhaul, this country. And the money is there for it, because the gap in the gap between rich and poor it was already immense in 2010, but now it is absurdly immense, and it's grown more than it has in other countries in Western Europe, and it needs a massive overhaul. And that's what I'd sort of think, when people say, well, you've got, and poor Labour, they're going to have all these very difficult situations, so they can't do anything radical. In 1945, what Clement Attlee took over was a little bit more tricky than what we're going to have to put up with at the end of this government. It was the end of the Second World War, which had been even more difficult than the years of austerity. And they didn't they didn't send people out all day to go, well, it is a very difficult situation. And given the legacy we've been left of thousands of bombed houses because of the Blitz, then we can't really do anything. They did the very opposite. They said, we're going to have to completely overhaul the whole place.
Yeah,
and
they
that
didn't
is
even
what
have
it needs.
They didn't even have an NHS to say they were going to protect. They had to start from scratch. What we need is an NHS. I don't see why, really, the current Labour lot aren't coming out saying, well, do you know what? We've done it before. We can do it again. But you're better than us, everybody.
They seem very, very scared.
Get the gloves on and off we go. Now, what do you think, everybody? What would you like the budget to do for you? Whether you are in the richest couple of percent, the poorest couple of percent, somewhere in the middle, what do you want Jeremy Hunt to do when he stands up on Wednesday? Please don't say self-combust. Mike says, changes to non-dom status is a policy government have fought against for years, and it's designed just to put the next government in a hole financially. It's salting the earth for Labour. Now, this is the suggestion that Jeremy Hunt might abolish non-dom tax status, which is the thing that a lot of Labour policy plans, such as there are, very few of them, 3 plans they've got, has been basically funded by saying, well, we'll abolish non-dom tax status. So if you don't live in this country, you've still got to pay some tax if you're not British. If you're here, you can't say you're registered in, Mauritius and pay your taxes there. You have to pay your taxes here if you live here and if your children are here and if your life is here, like Mrs. Rishi Sunak didn't to start with. And that is nicking the idea from Labour. And as Mike says, basically just sort of putting the next government in a hole. Do you think, Mark, that I suppose a lot of the budget isn't going to be, seeing as we all know the government's going to change, the budget isn't going to be about great Tory ideas. It is just going to be, as Mike says, trying to bugger it up as much as possible for the next bloke.
Yeah, I suppose. Yes, definitely there'll be a bit of that. But if he was a bit imaginative with that, like my alphabetical plan, and then because they know that then, but by the evening there'd be an interview with Rachel Reeves going, "Are you going to reverse the Chancellor's plans to make tax alphabetical?" And she'd go, "No, we are going to stick for the first 2 years to the Tories' alphabetical plan."
Yeah, and that's quite depressing to everybody, isn't it? Now, if you're Tory, right? I don't know if we've got any Tory voters watching this, possibly been frightened away today by just thinking Mark was on, and they've just gone, "No, that's it. I'm going to go and have to go and shoot."
Oh, right, they like me.
I'm not going to listen to that bit. But if you are a Tory, then a tax cut seems like a nailed-on way to win some votes. They love tax cuts. Why doesn't everybody love tax cuts? But like we've heard, Tory tax cuts can be a bit unfair. And also the current polling is showing that the public, the great British public, doesn't want a tax cut. They actually want, while the country's in such a state, what polls are showing that 3/4 of people want more public spending, not less. And of course, you've got to have a tax cut by cutting something else. And no one, everything's potholed. I don't want any more cuts. I want some spending, please. Why do you think, Mark, I suppose it's a bit of a psychoanalytical question, why do you think the Tories are still going for this? Are they blindly following an ideology? We must cut taxes, that's who we are. Or are they in complete denial like Liz Truss and going, well, this will work, it's fine? And they think everyone's just going to come around to their way of thinking by election day, maybe?
B, I think. I think they think that this always works. This always works. At every election, you say, Labour will raise taxes and spend all your money. They'll come round and take your pets and sell them and use the money to give to the unions and all this stuff that they will say. And they will still say at the next election about Keir Starmer, even though that's so utterly absurd, but they will do it. That is what they have always done, and they believe that they can't understand when it. Well, I mean, in the first election that Corbyn fought, they got completely confused, didn't they? Because they would say all of these things that normally work, and then they didn't. They would say Labour's going to raise taxes and so on, and Corbyn said yes. I know that he was a disaster in the second election he fought, but and then when it doesn't work, they just don't understand it. It's like a scientist suddenly seeing that something that always happens isn't happening.
Yeah, they seem to ask what's wrong with the voters, as opposed to what's wrong with us. They don't have that moment of sort of introspection, do they, Angus?
Yes, so they believe that if we say Labour is just going to spend all your money, and it worked in 1992 and it's worked in various other elections, Labour will tax you and they'll make you sell all your relatives and stuff like that. You'll have to prise open all your floorboards and Labour's new floorboard tax, all of that.
Labour will sugar relatives and we'll only tax giraffes. Vote for us.
Yeah.
Everything will be fine.
I think this time, I think you're right. This time, none of it works, and it's partly because there isn't an enthusiasm for tax cuts over services, because so many people are affected by that. Even people who aren't directly affected by it, their families are, and so on. They've seen out what happens when all these things get cut, but also because nobody believes what the Tories are saying anyway. We just don't believe them. They're incompetent. They're useless. And I think that's obviously it's big generalisation to say that's what people are thinking. But clearly that is what millions of people, including millions of people who voted for Boris Johnson, are thinking that. And I think even if their votes don't go to Labour, they won't go back to the Conservatives. As that, and the by-election the other day when Labour made such a magnificent effort I thought it was very imaginative of Labour to hand the running of the Rochdale by-election to the very first person who got knocked out of last year's Apprentice. That level of stupidity they had to take.
He did, didn't he? Well, Celebrity Big Brother's starting again, I think, this week.
Yes, but if the Tory vote collapsed, and even when the Labour candidate was non-existent, literally didn't exist because they'd been sown by Labour, then those votes didn't go back to the Tories. They went to either an independent guy or to George Galloway. So the people, including many people who voted Tory before, would rather vote for anyone than go back to the Conservatives. So I think that's the pickle that Jeremy Hunt's in.
I think what they haven't quite figured out is that the vote for Brexit, in many ways, was a vote for more public spending. It was a sort of a cri de coeur and a complaint that things weren't great and we needed some cash back from the EU and we don't want to spend so much money on that. We want to spend the money on this. And they seem to think it was a vote for, anti-immigration and we hate foreigners and we want more business deregulation and all the rest of that.
Well, it was that as well, though, wasn't it?
It was a bit, it was quite a bit of racism, let's face it. But I think a lot of it was also we want more spending on stuff that's important to us, and that bit seems to have not just bypass them totally.
Well, as a person of Kent, Susie, you'll know that a lot of the people in Kent will have voted Brexit because they thought there were too many immigrants. And now the population of Kent is gone up to about 30 million, 29 million of which are Romanian truck drivers stuck on the M2.
Exactly, they are. But I want to point out that Tunbridge Wells and Canterbury both voted Remain.
Okay.
And also, Kent was the only place that wasn't conquered in 1066. All right, so the People's Republic is.
I speak as a Kent person myself. Swanley.
Wrong side of the Medway, mate. No, you're on the south side. You're the same side as Nigel Farage.
You've got to be careful when there's a civil war with you.
We don't speak to people on the other side of the Medway. They're wrong-uns. They let the conqueror in. Now, getting back to the actual thing we're talking about, was Tory tax cuts. What does Labour do about this? Because Rachel Reeves done all these sums. She and Keir have been really cautious and said, we don't have much money now. And then we're going to get into Downing Street and they're going to find Jeremy Hunt's already done some of the stuff they wanted to do. What do you think, everybody? What should Labour do with this? Can they do anything? Do you feel really sorry for them? The GOAT, the greatest of all time, 1892, says, Starmer has too much power in the Labour Party and no integrity. However, the alternative of 5 more years of the Tories is not an option. You sound completely adrift a bit there, the GOAT, as to know what to do with your vote. Hopefully you're going to do something with it. I think having a bit more power in the leader rather than membership is probably a reversal of what we had under Corbyn, and therefore perhaps it's going to make a difference to electability, which is why we do it. Leslie says, when are we voters going to realise the difference between spending our taxes on us and spending our taxes on political friends to gain funding for the next election? Now, this is something you might not have heard this morning, Mark. Jeremy Hunt has had a donation of £100,000 to his constituency party. Who do you think the donor was?
Yeah, it was him, wasn't it?
It was him. He paid his own constituency £100,000, presumably for leafleting and staff costs and rent and just to keep it all together.
Yeah, we all do that. Every time my radio show is up for is up for an award, I'd spend £100,000 on campaigning locally in order to get people to vote. I know it's
madness. I mean, and it does imply rather that the Tories run out of other donors, so having to use their own money at this stage. I wonder if
they should have to use their own money, shouldn't they?
Sorry?
They should have to use their own money.
Yeah, but the problem with that is then people who don't have a huge amount of money are at a disadvantage.
Oh yeah, no, I know that, but they should have to use it, especially when they're certain to lose. I think that's the law that they have to donate it for an utterly useless cause. MPs. Yeah, well, of course, and so many other things as well that they have spent the money on, and that's why when you almost have to stop yourself doing this because you could get too angry thinking about this. But when if you remember back in the early days of austerity, for the first sort of year or so of austerity, Grant Shapps and various people like that would make these speeches 5 times a day where they would say, here is another example of the waste that has happened under Labour. And they would say, Trafford councillors spent over £700 on biscuits in the last 2 years, that sort of thing. Carrier bags. Lambeth Council has spent £65 billion on carrier bags unnecessarily and all that sort of thing. If the deficit was a swarm of bees, the whole of Mexico would have been stung by the deficit. All of these stupid statistics they would come out with. And that is the government that then went on, having used that to justify the most vicious cuts that destroyed so many people's lives. That's the government that then ended up spending billions and billions on handing contracts to their mates, particularly during COVID, and in so many ways have just wasted squillions more than they could even pretend that these councils wasted. That meant that they had to bring in austerity, and it doesn't do to think back on it really.
No, well, exactly. And if they leave government this year, then they're going to be leaving it with an even higher debt than they started with. And I'm sure people blame it all on the pandemic to some extent, but it's also to do with how you decide to spend the money, isn't it? Mike says, I hope the budget is well received this week because Sunak is likely to grasp any straw, may go for a May general election. Before we go on to good news, Mark, what's your betting for May? Because I think May's very likely, because if they've got local elections then, if they don't have it on the same day, then when they do have the election later, they'll find that because the local elections will have lost all the Tory councillors the entire length and breadth of the country. They'll be in a mincer somewhere. They won't have any activists to help them campaign for a later election. They've got to go for May, really. What do you reckon?
Oh, I don't know. I doubt it. He's Prime Minister, isn't he? And after the election, he's not going to be Prime Minister. He wants to be Prime Minister. So if he stays for another 6 months, he'll be Prime Minister for another 6 months. I don't think it's any more complicated than that, is it?
Do you think he wants to be Prime Minister? Because, I mean, when he came out and gave that speech in Downing Street last Friday and said, well, everything's gone out in a handcart. George Galloway's just got elected. No, Jews and Muslims are unsafe on the streets. Everything's awful.
Oh, wouldn't it be brilliant? Wouldn't it be brilliant if he came out, he's got to make a speech, is he, in defence of the budget, has he? I expect if he just goes... Yeah, no, I know, but Rishi Sunak will have to sort of answer for it when he Prime Minister's questions. And if he just went, I don't care, I wanted to become Prime Minister. My wife was disgusted with me because I'm only got 1% of the wealth she has. And I said, but I'm a politician. And so she said, yeah, but you're only Chancellor. So I wanted to be Prime Minister and it's brought me nothing but trouble. I've got to talk to homeless people. Then I'll get in trouble for asking them if they run their own business and everybody. Just trouble. George Gov. No. Balls to all of you. I'm going. I'm resigning. I'm having an election. There's nothing any of you can do about it. I'm not even campaigning for it. I'm going to go and hire an allotment next to Jeremy Corbyn's and chat to him.
I think you're probably more likely to go to California and spend his days roller skating up and down.
Wouldn't it be brilliant, though? So if he just called an election out of just being like, that would be just brilliant. There'd be nothing they could do.
No, they're absolutely stuffed.
But I doubt that'll happen. But it would be marvellous.
Yes, well, I suspect there'll be a taste of that whenever he does get round to it. But we'll have to see, won't we? Now, Thank you very much for all that, Mark. Do let us know, anybody, if you have any final thoughts that you want to discuss about what Labour can do about the budget, whether there should be a public inquiry into the Battle of Orgreave. If you have learned something about the Battle of Orgreave that you didn't previously know, who knows? If you can tell us something about it. What do you think about the budget and how it's all going to work? Let us know. But in the meantime, to round off, we have managed to find some good news for you. And it's been a grim day, but we have found some good news. Here it is. Now, this is the grim bit, I'm afraid. So at the last general election, 14,000 British voters were turned away from the polls for not having ID after, strange sort of deals on ID were brought in. So if you were a pensioner, your bus pass would count. And if you were a student, your bus pass didn't count. Stupid stuff like that. So hopefully some of them went home and got their passport and came back again. But even if they did have that, they're less likely to return once you've been chucked out and all the rest of it. So it's basically gerrymandering. This time around, there is a major campaign launching to get people to register to vote. Hooray! So they're ready and waiting, pencils poised on polling day. Now, Mark, is this proof, do you think, maybe that voting for better governments, maybe ones who don't stage pitch battles with out-of-work miners, ones who take all the money for themselves or their mates, it is always a good idea and we should encourage people to go out and register?
Well, I should definitely encourage people to go out and register to vote. I think we should also encourage people to create a fuss about this old new ID business in the first place, because it's clearly just in order to try and protect the government, wasn't it? It wasn't, like, as you say, it was. If you are from a council estate, then you're not allowed to vote. It's like, it's all that one of these sorts of things, like the things they have in America, where they don't even really pretend that it's not fiddled.
Exactly. They just if you're black, you can't vote, basically. In fact, they used to have that rule in America. And then when they replaced that rule, because after the Civil War, and they decided black people could vote, you could only vote if you could pass a certain literacy test. It's up to the person at the polling station to do the literacy test. And if they thought you weren't quite right, no, you can't vote, mate. So obviously in some parts of the world, if you're black, you just didn't get to vote, which was pretty horrific. And it's hopefully, if Labour gets in, they can't really overturn this law, can they? They can't say, well, you don't need ID to vote. Bollocks! You can all come back and do what you like. They're going to have to keep the ID, but hopefully they would sort of open it.
Why do they have to keep the ID? Why can't they scrap that?
Well,
that's how it's been forever up until just now.
The Tories would say, well, you've let it open to fraud. And as soon as there's one,
it doesn't matter what they say. If they say and then Labour say, well, it was never. So are you saying that every election up until the last one was fraudulent? Then all the elections, and in any case, nobody's listening to you. You've just lost massively, and now you're at war with yourself. Go away. It doesn't matter what they. Yeah. I mean, what's the point of Labour getting in if it's going to go? We can't do anything the Tories wouldn't do, because then they might as well say, to be really, really safe and make sure that he doesn't upset Tory voters, what Keir Starmer needs to say is, if we win the election, we're going to let the Tories carry on.
Oh, God, please don't know. Do you think that's what Labour are saying, really, effectively?
No, I don't think it's what they're saying. But I think if that's the argument, that we can't do anything that the Tories would disapprove of because they would complain about it, then that is, in effect, what you're saying.
Yeah.
You might as well let them carry on. I don't think that is what Labour's saying, but that's that argument.
Well, they've got a lot.
I listen, as many people do sometimes, to that podcast that Alistair Campbell does with Rory Stewart. And one of the things I find fascinating about it in recent months is that increasingly robustly, Alistair Campbell is agitated because the Labour Party won't come up with targets, if you like, that the Tories are forced to attack. And there's a sort of misreading of the 1997 campaign that the Labour Party didn't come up with anything. It just did exactly what the Tories were doing. That wasn't quite the case. And the minimum wage in particular came under ferocious attack from the Conservatives and the Conservative press. And that was deliberate, and that was a good campaigning strategy. I'm not won with New Labour at all. But that was a really good thing. And I think Labour needs something like that. They need the equivalent of all these things, devolution, banning fox hunting, gay, well, it wasn't marriage at first, was it? But civil partnerships and so on. It looked like there was radical change coming. And of course, the Conservatives went berserk about all those things, and it made them even more unpopular because they were attacking things that were clearly right.
People liked, yeah. Well, maybe, I mean, Keir and Rachel and all the rest of them have got an awful lot to do, and they've got to do it probably in the first couple of years. They've got to sort out polling ID, election ID. They've got to sort out non-dom status. They've got to tax Eton until it screams, basically, for anyone's happy with them. They've got to compensate the infected blood people. Apparently, it's been breached today that the delay in compensation for infected blood and the post office is what will be leading to and paying for any tax cuts, because they're offsetting the money in the pot that's for them against what they've got to do. So we actually can't afford the tax cuts, but they're just using the billions they're not paying out to people who deserve it. And they've got to sort out nuclear test veterans, Battle of Orgreave, the NHS, education, dentistry, aqueducts, and God knows what else. It's going to be an awful lot of work for them for the first couple of years. So good thing it's them and not us. Anyway, thank you, Mark, for taking us through all that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We will see you all again on Wednesday morning on Budget Day, bright and breezy, for a dissection of exactly what kites are being flown and what crap is being talked then with Jason Beattie. So join us back here on Wednesday for that. And until then, thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. And we'll see you on Wednesday morning. Till then, tatty bye.